Thank you, Mr. Tezak, for such a lovely introduction this morning. I also want to thank Anthony Napoli for the invitation to come be the keynote speaker for today's event. In case you were wondering how Anthony and I know each other, he was a former student worker of mine at RIT. That was back in the 1990s. We're going to stick with this slide for a little while. When I got the invitation to be the keynote speaker for the 2013 National Disability Employment Awareness Month event for this program, I started to look back on the barriers that I personally faced throughout my education and employment. So I decided that this would be the title of my presentation today. The most common phrase given to me was that the sky was the limit. However, as I journeyed my way through employment obstacles and successes, I often wondered. I wondered if the sky truly was the limit. So my plan for today is to talk to you about my career journey throughout my education and employment. But first, allow me to share with you a couple of pictures about who I am. I was born in Richmond, Virginia. This is a picture of my mother and I. My father passed away in service. He served in World War II, and he passed away at the age of 26, and I was about 2 months of age at that time. So my mother and I moved in with my mother's parents and my mother's sister, who would take care of me while my mother worked to support us. When I was 3.5 years of age, my family learned that I was profoundly deaf. I couldn't hear a thing. My mother and my grandparents decided that I was going to learn how to speak and read lips. After my mother remarried, we relocated to Illinois, and then later on to Missouri. And that was where my stepfather found a job at a publishing company. That's when I started to attend a private school for oral deaf children until the age of 14. I didn't learn to sign until I was about 17 years of age. And that's when I started to date a really nice gentleman who later became my husband. My first dream for myself was to be a cowgirl. I loved watching the Hopalong Cassidy TV programs. My parents actually ordered a very similar outfit for me for my 4th birthday. I can remember that being one of the most exciting times in my life. But we don't live out in the country, so I had to tuck away those dreams and move on to my second dream, which was to be a dancer. I loved watching Fred Astaire and how he could move. I actually took dance lessons from the age of 5 until the age of 14. I stopped pursuing that dream of becoming a professional dancer because people didn't believe that I could. They said that I would have to be able to hear the music to be a professional dancer. They said that following their compliments of my sense of rhythm and my ability to dance. Then I decided I wanted to be an English teacher. My mother used to teach English. And my father was a freelance writer. Again, I was discouraged from pursuing that goal because I was told that I had to be able to teach speech in order to be an English teacher. By believing these people, I developed a really low self-esteem. Much later in life, I started tutoring students in English, and I actually performed in a couple of dance shows. During the first 24 years of my life, there was no technology like TTYs. There were no closed captions on the television set. There were no computers. So independent accessibility to information was rock bottom for deaf people, even though I didn't realize at the time until I was much older. I attended public school. I was the only deaf student in the classroom. I didn't have an interpreter. So I started to develop survival skills. I would read lips, and I would ask my colleagues and friends for help. So I would ask my friends to use carbon paper so that I could take home a copy of their classroom notes. I always sat in the corner seat of the first row in every classroom I was in so that I could read the teacher's lips. It was always challenging when the teacher would turn around and write on the chalkboard and continue to speak. Even though I reminded the teachers over and over, they still continued to do this. I remember it was November the 22nd, 1964. I was in a history class and the teacher screamed, "What?" and ran out of the classroom. My classmate told me that somebody was running in the hallway and screaming, "John was shot." The teacher's son was named John. I was later informed that it was John F. Kennedy that was shot. That was the amount of detail that I got until I came home and read about it in the paper. There's been several times I remember wanting to quit high school. I was making C's and D's in all of the classes except for my English class, my typing class, and my art class. Those classes I got an A. I completed my requirements for my bachelor's degree when I was 39 years of age. I was a mother of 2 children at that time, and then later completed my master's when I was 49. So to make a long story short, I finally could participate in class discussions and talk with my professors through the use of an interpreter when I was in college. I didn't have an easy time trying to find employment in the 1960s because many positions require the use of a telephone. So I worked at a bookkeeping machine operator at a couple of different companies. And then after TTYs came into the scene and then later interpreters, it was then much easier to find a job. There were still barriers, however. I was working as a social worker at an alcohol treatment center, and a colleague brought me a note from another coworker in another office. I told my coworker not to be the mediator. I told them to take the note back to the original writer and have them come and talk to me themselves. So that was one of the many ways that I would encourage people to communicate with me directly. In the mid-1980s, I was working at the Rochester Institute of Technology in the Student Health Center. There was a tragic news of the Space Shuttle Challenger, and the announcement came on the loudspeaker. I would have never known about that if I didn't happen to be working with a lab technician who was also an interpreter in my department. The TV in the waiting room didn't have closed captions, so the lab technician would interpret the news to me and to the other clients. So imagine the difference that it made 15 years later when we were experiencing 9/11. They were completely and consistently captioned. I didn't need to ask my coworkers what was going on or to interpret for me. In the 1990s, I remember walking out of the ladies' room and seeing everyone run to the nearest exit. I had no idea what was going on. I tried to grab somebody's attention and ask what was going on, and they said it was a fire alarm was going off. Huh. Well, immediately after that, I did ask management to please put the appropriate fire alarms with light detecting signals in the bathroom. I grew up thinking that my deafness was a handicap. But as I learned more about myself, I learned that it's not my handicap. When people apologize to me that they're not able to sign and communicate with me, it's their handicap, not mine. I don't want the apology. I tell them that we can still communicate. We can write back and forth. I tell them, well, we can use an interpreter to communicate. And I love to write. My speech may not be as perfect as yours, but people generally understand me if they take the time to really listen. When they're fearful of communicating with deaf people, that is their handicap, not the deaf person. Attitude is another barrier that I've faced in the past. People don't realize that I'm deaf until I'm introduced to them or whenever I start to sign. They oftentimes think I have laryngitis or I'm from a different country. I have to let them know that I am in fact deaf. And people have the wrong idea when they ask me if I've ever thought about getting a cochlear implant. And when I tell them no, I've always been deaf, and I'm happy this way. Some people are shocked. Some people begin to understand where I'm coming from. The point here is that not all deaf people are the same, but we all have the same accessibility issues. Instead of being quote-unquote handicapped, I'm very capable. Instead of being disabled, I am very able. This means that anyone, regardless of who you are capable and able. We all have our limitations, but we are not limited with what we want to do. When we have better access, everything is available. I chose this theme to my talk because I feel that it relates to the theme of this event, because we are all equal to the task. And it will then require that throughout the future, everyone understand that we deserve to have education, training, experience, and the desire to be successful in the workplace. No one shall stop us. One of my favorite quotes is from Hallmark. Dream, dare, persevere, succeed. So was the sky the limit? Another favorite quote that I share with young children is this: let's enhance the path to a brighter, barrier-free future for young, deaf women and men, so that they can leap to new heights. So the sky is not the limit. The sky is just the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hurwitz, for your insightful words. Let's give her another round of applause.
Thank you.
I would like to open the floor for any questions from the audience.
I won't bite.
Thank you. Hey, hi. My name is Wayne Winterling from CBP.
Hello. And where are you working again?
I'm at CBP. I have a question. I'm not a techie, but there's a lot of techie people, I'm sure, in the room here. What is the most technological advancement that has helped you to succeed in finding the sky as just the beginning?
iPhones, iPads, all of those things, video phones. I think that it just gives me the opportunity to communicate with anyone.
Hello, my name is Michael, and I'm from the Environmental Protection Agency. I want to thank you for being here and for sharing your story with us. My question is, with the students you work with on a day-to-day basis, how are their stories different or similar to your life story and your experiences? I'd like to know if there have been any changes or obstacles removed, or is the story still the same?
And that is such an interesting question. These students are from a different generation, and they still have some barriers, yes. One would be that when they're taking classes at another university and they don't have an interpreter, and they have to fight for themselves, and they have to fight to get the interpreter. There are several accessibility issues that students face today, and I'm trying to think of some examples. An interpreter is one. Not having a video phone in an office where an employee would work or where they're interning, those would be another. And again, they come from a very different generation. I tell the students often that they need to be more assertive. They need to ask for the things that they need and the things that they want. But at the same time, I tell them about what I've been through and how I learned to survive without all of these types of technology. And they can do better by helping future generations.
Question. I think they can hear me. I wanted to thank you for a wonderful speech. It was very uplifting.
Thank you.
And I wanted to ask you, what is the employment rate of Gallaudet graduates? And second question is, have you seen an increase in the enrollment at Gallaudet in the past year?
Yes. Yes to all those questions. Yes. Now, I'm not good with numbers, and I didn't do well in math, so I did not do the research. I would have to ask my husband, Alan, and I often have to ask him again and again what the employment rate is for our graduates. But yes, it has improved. And students do get jobs, and fortunately, they start working in internships, and many of those places where they're interning have invited them back to stay after they graduate. So internships are so important for our students. You're welcome.
My name is Franklin Jones. I'm from U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And my question is, in turn, you talked about challenges and kids having to stand up and speak for themselves. Can you tell me what one of your greatest challenges as you were, I guess, making your way through life is the best way to put it?
Gosh, I've had lots of challenges. In terms of employment or anything? Okay, let me think. Oh. Well, before the days of TTYs, I was waiting in the airport. I was getting ready to board a plane, and I didn't know that my flight was changed to another gate. I missed my flight. So I then approached a service office, and they have an office that specifically services people with disabilities. And I said, hey, I missed my flight. Nobody told me that the gate had changed for my plane, and why did that happen? And they were like, oh, I'm so sorry. And I said, I got to get on this plane. I'm headed to Seattle. I have to get there. And I was also watching one of my favorite TV programs, and I didn't want to miss it that night. That was very important. But I told the person at the desk that I wanted to get to Seattle because I had to meet with a very important person. I was lying. I lied. I wanted to get there so I could watch my favorite TV program. I was going to watch it with my friends, and so she was working feverishly, and she got me on a plane. And I got there on time. So it worked out well. But that's always been one challenge. I oftentimes find myself not knowing what was going on. Now I pick up my smartphone and I make sure that I'm at the right gate.
So, looking at your days of employment and now where you are, I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind talking about the role that you've had in continuing to keep moving forward. And really looking at who were the people that kept you going, who were the people that you looked up to, your role models.
Perhaps he remembers what I told him so many years ago whenever he was working with me that might have sparked this question today. Remember I mentioned that I wanted to quit high school. And that was the turning point because I started dating my now husband. I was quite young, I was in high school. But when I mentioned to him that I wanted to quit high school, he said, no, you can't do that. And he pushed and pushed and pushed me. He was already in his first year of college at that time. So I didn't have another role model to look up to. Not a deaf role model, mind you. Alan is deaf. He was born deaf like I was. His parents are deaf. His parents never went to college. Alan did. So I stuck with it. I finally finished high school. He still had 1 year left in college. So I decided to attend a women's college that was not far from home. It was just enough to be close to Alan, and just enough to be able to get through at least 1 year of college without an interpreter again. But that was it. We got married, and he encouraged me to pursue my education, so I started going to a community college until I got in a car accident. And that was in the first semester, so I stopped going to school. I started working, and life kind of went on over the years. And Alan again mentioned, honey, you should go back to college, you should get a degree. And I didn't really have strong feelings for it, but there was a woman that worked for vocational rehabilitation, and she asked me one day what I liked to do. And I said, I love to teach English, I love to tutor, and I love to write. And so she said, well, I have lots of clients. Would you be interested in teaching them and tutoring them? So I agreed, and I did that for about 3 years while I was at RIT. The assistant to the superintendent of that school sought me out and recognized me for my work and asked if I would consider being a substitute teacher. And again, I didn't have a college degree at the time, and so I was a little surprised, but I agreed. I filled out the application form, but I didn't hear anything from them until about a month later when I reminded the assistant to the superintendent about this position, and they said, I'm so sorry, I didn't know that you didn't have a college degree. Well, a piece of paper is all I needed. That was it. That was all the fire I needed to go back to school. For a piece of paper. A piece of paper that was going to catapult me so far. So I really do have to thank Alan. He pushed me and encouraged me and cheered me on. He was my first role model. I met others later on, but he was really the first one. Even though he was a man, it didn't really matter.
So I have a question for you.
So I am generationally deaf, and things have been much better for us because the people in your generation have fought for us. So I do want to thank you for that, first of all. My question is, do you feel that the younger deaf generation is still fighting the fight? Do you feel that they're doing enough to fight for the deaf community? What's your perspective on that? Is there things that we can do about or what? Yes, they're still fighting. The younger generation is still fighting. All you have to do is open up a web page on the internet. CRPD, for example, is a critical piece of legislation that's happening, and I encourage them to keep advocating for their rights. Yes, they're still fighting. They send out petitions and they ask for signatures. So I see that they are fighting for many different issues, still in the areas of education and employment. But yes, and that has to continue, absolutely. I did want to make a comment. Oh, no, go ahead. No, please.
So this time the microphone is working. Great. There's a TV commercial that I've seen a whole bunch of times, but I don't know. I can't remember who's pushing the product, but part of the commercial has a woman who has had some sort of hearing device, an implant of some sort. And they ask her, "Can you hear me?" And she breaks out and starts crying because she apparently is hearing for the first time. And I think maybe some of us have seen that commercial. And then the question is there a stigma attached to deaf people who are looking to regain or gain hearing?
That's a very good question. Well, when the cochlear implant first came into the scene, there was quite an uproar around it. It seems as though that has subsided. The commercial that you're speaking of is actually talking about the cochlear implant, and I'm not very thrilled about that particular commercial. But it's because it doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't talk about all the things that are involved in having the surgery. I do support deaf people who have lost their hearing later in life to consider this. They're able to remember sound. So if they're able to regain their hearing, then yes, it is effective and beneficial. I'm not so sure if it's a great idea to have this invasive surgery on babies. I'm not in favor of that. If parents are willing to teach a child how to sign while they have their implant, because again, the cochlear implant is just a tool, but it is quite invasive, as opposed to a hearing aid. A hearing aid you can put on, you can take off. I think I'm going to stop here. I think that I'm going to be careful with my answer here. But yes, I do have strong opinions about that. I have many friends with cochlear implants, and it works great for them. And I wouldn't know the difference. I sometimes forget that they even have a cochlear implant because it's just not who they are. It's just something about them, and they're still using sign language to communicate, and they don't have a negative attitude around that. So I'm just going to stop with that. So I wanted to make a comment. So when the announcement came out about this, my husband received an email from the employment of DOC, and this employee happened to be a mother of 2 kids, and she was talking about her son who has a disability, and she's not able to attend the event today. So Alan forwarded her email to me because she wanted to ask me some questions, even though she couldn't attend. So we talked back and forth on email, and I answered her questions. And we planned to call each other on the video phone, but unfortunately scheduling did not permit that. So I sent some resources to her, and she responded ever so graciously, and there were many resources that she was not aware of. She had gone to several different agencies asking for help, and still wasn't given these resources. So I want to sit with this woman and find out more about how her son is doing. And I say that to share with you that there are still people that need information. I feel that anytime a person asks me questions about what to do with their deaf children, it strikes a chord. I do give parents the credit. They're fighting for their children and what they need.
Hi, I work with interpreting services at the EPA. And my question is, how can hearing coworkers best be an ally to deaf workers?
That is such a good question. Find ways to communicate with them. Find out what they want. Befriend them. If I could just add one more thing about schooling. My daughter is adopted, and she is deaf. I have a son who's also hard of hearing. But my daughter had a really difficult time in school. She's not an academic, so she struggled, and she tried very much to be like my husband and I, because we graduated college and did well, and so she struggled. She had some difficulty. She does great now. She's a teacher's assistant at the Rochester Institute for the Deaf. But the point that I'm trying to make is, when she was about 10 or 11 years of age, Alan and I had to fight for her rights in school, academically. Because she is not an academic, she needed some special services, like taking a test alone. She had ADHD, which wasn't discovered until after she graduated from school. She barely passed her test and her classes so that she could get her diploma. She was a very lucky girl. Her classmates, including Anthony Napoli, they were huge supporters and cheerleaders for her, and she finally did it. She made it through. She also had tutoring services and other types of services along with that. When I met with the principal and her teachers, and when we started to discuss her IEP, the individualized education plan for my daughter, the teachers had several notes, and I felt like there was something missing. So I had to fight for additional services for her, things that weren't included. Some more speech training. I'm deaf, my husband's deaf, we can't teach her speech. We could teach her how to read lips, but we knew that she could speak, but she just needed more training so that she could communicate with others out in the real world. She's a very proficient signer. But I noticed that the speech training wasn't included, and the teacher said, oh, we don't have this, we don't have the money, we don't have the resources, we don't have this. And so I said, okay, you can go ahead and design your IEP how much you want, however you want, but I'm not going to sign it. And she said, well, you have to. I said, no, absolutely not. I'm not going to sign it. You can continue how you see fit, but I need more for her. I'm not going to sign this IEP until everything